Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Broadview's National Online Reading Club. My name is Emma Prestwich, and I'm Broadview's Digital and United Church in Focus editor. Working behind the scenes to help me out tonight, maybe you can wave if you'd like, is Charlotte Alden, who is a summer intern with Broadview. We're so glad that you've taken an hour out of your evening to be here with us. I'm speaking to you today from the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat, the original owners and custodians of this land. Today, Toronto is home to many, including a diverse urban Indigenous community of Inuit, First Nations, and Métis. And Toronto is where our office is, so that's where I'm speaking to you from. We'd love to know who you are and where you're from, so please say hello from your hometown in the chat space. Also, if you're from a faith community and you want to add that as well, please do so. And if you would like to add your own land acknowledgement from wherever you are, I invite you to share that as well. Just a few little notes before we get started. I want you to know that we're recording this session so we can share this event with others later. And if you feel at all uncomfortable with your thumbnail video appearing on the recording, please turn off your video now. And please mute your audio unless you're asking a question, and in that circumstance, you'll be called on. So please keep your audio off unless you're doing that, or we may mute it for you. But please do use the chat function to ask questions, add comments during the event. Welcome all of that engagement. Also recommend that you use speaker view rather than gallery view. So that's a bit of a better experience to see the guests. This evening, we're going to hear from Josiah Neufeld, Catherine Wreford, and Emilio Rodriguez, all of whom were featured in or contributed to the July-August 2023 issue of Broadview. So one final note before we get started. As I mentioned earlier, after our speakers have told us a bit about themselves and their stories, there will be a chance to ask questions. Charlotte will post some instructions on how to ask questions in the chat space. I have a few ready, but this is your time to talk to our guests about their stories, and we'll have a more vibrant conversation if there's more participation. So let's get started. Our first guest is Josiah Neufeld. Josiah is a writer and journalist who lives in Winnipeg. He's written many stories for Broadview, including most recently a journalistic comic with illustrator Jonathan Dick. His new book, The Temple at the End of the Universe, explores how the climate crisis is shifting the ground of religious belief, and he also explores his move away from his childhood faith. Please welcome Josiah.
Thank you. I'm here in Winnipeg, Treaty 1 territory, home of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dene, and the Red River Métis. And I'm going to be saying a few words about my book, which Emma mentioned, and then I'll read a brief excerpt, and then there will be I believe there will be time for questions. I'm not sure if the questions are coming right after my presentation or at the end, but either one works for me. So just briefly, this book, The Temple at the End of the Universe, is two things. It's a work of journalism and it's a spiritual memoir. And I wrote this book because I felt that we as humans were in the midst of a significant shift in our relationship with the life systems of our planet, and politically and economically, but also spiritually. And as a journalist, I was interested in exploring the religious and spiritual dimensions of that shift. The late Catholic eco-theologian Thomas Berry said that we needed a new story about our relationship with the earth because the old story was no longer working. And what was the old story that has helped bring us to this moment of crisis? And what is the new story that's emerging? Those were questions that I wanted to investigate when I set out to write this book. I also wrote this book because my own spiritual journey was in a moment of flux. I grew up the child of evangelical Mennonite missionaries. I too had grown up with a story that was no longer working, a story of human supremacy and colonization and a chosen people. And this story was part of the reason I felt that we were facing this crisis in the first place. So I went searching for a new story, a story that was equal to this, astonishing and alarming moment we're in. So in this book, I spend time with evangelical climate deniers. I spend time with Indigenous land defenders and some radical Catholic anti-pipeline activists. and a whole variety of people. And I hope it's a book that moves people to action, but I also want it to be a book that causes people to pause and rest deeply in the knowledge that we are held and loved in this moment. You know, we're in a difficult time, and it's important to acknowledge that. And it's also important to remember that there's beauty and compassion and meaning and deep community that can be found in this work. So I wanted to leave readers with kind of both of those experiences. So I'll just read a brief passage from the beginning of chapter 7, and then we can go on to the next, to the question and answers. This is from chapter 7. It's called Disobedient. I want to know how to pray. It's December 2021, Advent, a season of waiting. Everything is waiting, waiting for the pandemic to be over, waiting for our leaders to start acting like we're in a climate emergency, waiting for our hemisphere to tilt back into the light. We are hunkered down for our second COVID Christmas, separated from what we need most, each other. Meanwhile, in British Columbia, the city of Abbotsford is underwater. The town of Merritt has been evacuated. 15,000 people have fled their homes. Mere months ago, a heat wave killed more than 600 humans and cooked 1 billion sea creatures. Then came the wildfires that incinerated towns and turned forests into thickets of blackened pencils, and baked spongy soils into hardened surfaces that now funnel the rain in torrents. Heat, fire, and flood. Climate calamities come in threes now. And still our leaders bicker over diluted promises, unlikely to be kept and wholly inadequate for the emergency at hand. I need a light, something to guide me. I ask my spiritual director for a practice or a teaching, something to help me when despair washes over me. Look for spirit, she reminds me. There's a mystery bigger than we can know with our human senses. You're part of that mystery. I fully believe that. My partner Mona and I hang a star in our window. We tramp a spiral in the snow in our front yard and walk the labyrinth with our children, placing candles in jars on stumps as we sing, hope before us, hope behind us, hope under our feet. Our neighbor comes out to smoke on his front porch and watches our ritual with puzzled amazement. I know you got your whole environmental thing going on, he says, leaning over the fence. You should try sprinkling diesel fuel around your foundation. Keeps the mice from getting in. Old farm trick. I watch a video on YouTube. 4 Catholic activists trudge through knee-deep snow toward a fenced-in valve shut-off site along the Line 3 pipeline near Duluth. They carry a pair of bolt cutters and an orange Home Depot bucket full of rosaries, prayer flags, tobacco ties, and other sacred objects. They snip the padlock on the fence, enter the valve site, and attempt to shut off the flow of oil. But they are missing the right size of Allen wrench. They try to fashion a tool from a tiny metal crucifix, asking Christ for forgiveness as they remove his tiny suffering body from the metal cross. They hang rosaries on the fence and on the pipe itself. They call on saints to help them, saints who also broke the law for the greater good. Franz Jagerstatter, executed in 1943 for refusing to join the Nazi army. Philip Berrigan, arrested more than 100 times for acts of civil disobedience, protesting nuclear weapons. As I watch these 4 strangers fumble with inadequate tools and faltering faith, something ignites in me. These disobedient saints are swimming in a current I cannot see, but can surely feel. Their wavering voices join together in a hymn. It's a song I've heard before, but only in church. Here, at the scene of a crime against the powers of fossil fuel capitalism, the words have new meaning. From the halls of power to the fortress tower, not a stone will be left on stone. Let the king beware, for your justice tears every tyrant from his throne. The hungry poor shall weep no more, for the food they can never earn. There are tables spread, every mouth be fed, for the world is about to turn. Could the world be about to turn? The song brings tears to my eyes. The words are attributed to Mary, the mother of Jesus, single, pregnant, poor, a member of an occupied people. She has just learned her child will defy an empire. She doesn't know it will cost him his life. Through my computer speakers, I can hear the police sirens coming.
Thank you. Thank you for giving us some insight into your book. Thank you for sharing some of it with us. There is so much in it, and so many themes that you explore. I'm wondering, you speak early on in the book about grieving for your children and what they might experience. Many young people, teenagers, young adults, are experiencing some of the similar climate anxiety and hopelessness that you talk about experiencing. For those who are just coming into their own lives, what would you say to them?
Yeah, that's such an important question. And I think that, that hopelessness or that feeling of powerlessness or despair is real. And I've felt that feeling myself. I've learned what to do with it in some ways. It's important to honor those feelings of grief and even despair, and let them be part of our lives. It's not, we don't have, if we kind of try to force them out, it's not going to work. But I also think it's important to not stay there, to move beyond. And I really do think that kind of hopelessness or a bleak vision of the future is just as dangerous as sort of obliviousness, in the sense of the work that needs to be done, and the community that can be found in working together. So it depends who I'm talking to, what I kind of emphasize. If I feel like I'm speaking to an CEO of an oil company, then I need to lean into the harm that's being done. When I speak to younger people, I want to remind them that there's all kinds of possibilities for our future. There's amazing work being done by so many people, and there's so much life and community and meaning to be found in the work along the way. I think that's really the important piece that I want to communicate to younger people. Get involved in working for climate justice in the world. There's so many ways to be part of it, and it's really life-giving to join those communities and work together. So I don't want people to feel hopeless or despairing. I certainly hope my book won't leave people that way, because I think there are a lot of reasons for joy and solidarity in the work along the way.
There certainly are, and some of the encouraging energy, I think, around climate justice is coming from younger people.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
You talk about this new story that we need for our faith, for faith in general, and I think that many people who are in mainline church communities, like the United Church, for example, would like to see themselves as trying to live out that new story. Are there ways that we could do a better job of that?
Yeah, there's both of those things are true. The folks in the United Church that I didn't grow up in the United Church. My background is Mennonite. So it's a bit of a different world for me. I see so much that excites me and gives me a lot of joy when I look at things that are happening in the United Church around justice of all kinds, climate justice, the work that the United Church is doing to, I wrote a piece recently about faithful footprints and the work the United Churches are doing to transform their buildings. There's so much good work going on. I think United Church folks are telling that new story, and have been for a long time, and there is work to be done, things that need to be worked on. I don't have a critique of the United Church to offer right here, but because mostly I see good stuff that I think other churches should emulate. But certainly, retelling the story that we've been taught around, or at least the story that I grew up with was that there's only one story. I think that's part of the the binary that I grew up with. There's only one true story, and in fact there are many stories that are part of this transformation that we're experiencing, and we need to learn to listen to those, and the stories, both the stories within our tradition and the stories outside of our tradition. When I say our, I'm talking about other folks that are coming from a Christian, broadly speaking, tradition. So that's just, there's all kinds of stories that are being told that are very significant to this moment. Stories about, that help us have a more complex and nuanced understanding of our relationship with other living species and ecosystems and how interdependent we are. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but
no, that's good to hear. There is some encouraging work going on. To pivot back to hopelessness, Leaf in the chat has a question for you. He's wondering if the feelings of hopelessness and despair, if you feel like those feelings correlate to prophecies from the Bible, like in Revelation.
Not specifically. I mean, I think of, there's a piece in the book where I talk about the word apocalypse, which is from the root is a Greek word meaning new sight, and I think of the prophetic or apocalyptic literature that belongs to the Bible as more of an opportunity to imagine a new world rather than a dire warning about ecological catastrophe. I don't think that's what the authors. Climate change isn't what the authors of those texts had in mind when they were writing them. They were writing about empire and resistance. So I think there's a lot to be gathered from those works of apocalyptic literature, but I don't see them as prophecies foretelling the kind of things we're experiencing now.
Another question from Ray in the chat. Ray is wondering, what partnerships have you been able to establish? Ray, do you want to maybe elaborate on that a little more, what you mean by partnerships? There we go.
There, now you can hear me, I guess?
Yes.
Well, I've listened to Indigenous leaders speak passionately about Mother Earth. And I know big companies have it's our planet, it's our Earth. Big companies that may be some of the biggest contributors to the failing ecosystems. Are you able to partner with any of them to encourage them to be more planet friendly? I guess that's what I was asking.
The question is about bigger companies. I personally am not doing that kind of work in terms of partnering with big companies, but I've seen big companies that are doing good work. I think it was Patagonia recently that restructured the whole corporate structure of their company so that it wasn't benefiting a few. I think that I can't remember exactly how the structure. It was a big structural, restructuring that involves a significant amount of the profits going towards ecological restoration, and it kind of upended the, capitalist share wealth for the shareholders at all costs sort of structure. So I can't remember the exact details, but there are companies that are doing that kind of radical reimagining for sure.
Thank you very much.
There's a comment from Anne in the chat. Anne says, as a member of her United Church in Toronto, her church has a climate team, and she also belongs to one that is made up of a bunch of central Toronto churches. We do webinars and articles and presentations to teach people about living sustainably and how the city is addressing its climate challenges. That's wonderful. That's a great example of that work. I have one more question for you. I am interested in, this is certainly something I've noticed, and you address it a little bit, in almost the pride that can come from feeling like there is a sort of clear that sort of some of these that almost like being an environmental prophet has a similar tone to the kind of prosperity gospel that you are familiar with. That a sense of taking on responsibility for the climate crisis too wholly and individually has echoes of the pride of a preacher who claims to have all the answers, for example. Can you talk a little bit more? I know you explore that a bit in your book. Can you talk a little bit about that sort of connection of the dangers of attributing responsibility to individually?
Yeah, there's certainly the danger of that sort of human hubris that we can fix everything through these big technological fixes, but also I think, you know, in the book I struggle with this sense of the weight of kind of the personal individual responsibility, and you know, there's a hubris in that too, that I alone, you know, sometimes I think we live at a difficult time because we individually feel responsible for everything that's going wrong with the world. You know, where my water comes from, the lake where my water comes from, Shoal Lake, there's an indigenous community that lives there that's been pushed aside to make way for that aqueduct. So am I responsible for that water? You know, the minerals in my cell phone come from Democratic Republic of Congo that were mined. They were mined probably by children. You know, there's a sense that we're part of this huge network and we're responsible for everything, but at the same time we're kind of powerless to do anything, and that feels like the conundrum of our time. And so I think that it's really important to move from the individual sense of guilt and responsibility to kind of a collective understanding of the problem. And so, you know, I as an individual am not responsible for all the harm that's that's happening in the world, and I as an individual can't fix it either. And so it's really you know, a matter of shouldering this burden as communities, as collective groups of people, and finding strength and solidarity and community in that work. So I'm not sure if that's what you're getting to with your question, but certainly to me it's more meaningful to find ways to take collective action than for me to figure out how to live the most you know, perfect and low impact life in my own personal life. I think that's important for each of us to do that, but it's also it needs to be done in the context of collective organizing, community organizing, and working to change the structures that make it impossible for us to make different choices, right?
Well, I mean, you've certainly gone through the journey of moving from that sense of personal responsibility to seeing it as more of a collective struggle. So thank you so much for sharing that with us, sharing some of your reflections. And I believe Charlotte will post a link to your book. Encourage folks to read it. Thank you so much, Josiah, for being here and sharing your reflections.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I can stick around till the end of the hour to hear the other folks. So if people have questions, yeah, I'll be around. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So another story that involves hopelessness and hope will be told through our second guest, who is Catherine Wreford. Catherine is an actress, dancer, and singer who, with her longtime friend Craig Ramsey, won The Amazing Race Canada in 2022. She has performed on Broadway and on film. About a decade ago, she was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer, but I believe is still doing well at this point. Amazing. That's wonderful. That's so great to hear. Catherine and Craig have recently begun doing motivational presentations for schools, churches, and other organizations. And that's how we heard about their story. So thank you so much, Catherine, for being here.
You're welcome. So yes, my name is Catherine Wreford. And 10 years ago, I was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer and given 2 to 6 years to live. Let me back it up a bit. I grew up in Winnipeg. I moved to Toronto I got a job at the Stratford Festival, got many gigs on Broadway, ran a mortgage company in Los Angeles, became a nurse in Los Angeles, got married and had 2 kids. And then came the diagnosis when my second child was 5 weeks old. I was angry. I didn't want to believe in a God that would make me face this. It was 2 days before my 33rd birthday. My racing partner, Craig, was one of the reasons I went to get diagnosed. He was the first person I spoke to on the phone from the hospital. Craig and I have known each other for more than 25 years. We trust each other. We've also lived together in Toronto, New York, and Los Angeles. He knew me before my diagnosis, and he knew me after. He knows what I could do before and what I can't do now. He also knows that I never take no for an answer and will fight this as long as I'm living. I have encouraged Craig to continue his relationship with the United Church, as this church loves everyone and is very inclusive. He's part of the LGBTQIA+ community, and I am his ally. I think that we had been living in the United States for too long and didn't like the way it was always like politicized. I'm in the middle of a pretty horrible divorce where I was made to feel like a horrible friend, a horrible mother, and a horrible human being. I'm feeling so blessed that my chosen family was strong enough to wait it out until I was ready, then helped me get out of it. That help was so important. That help came from love, and God to me is love. To me, being kind and understanding is what this world needs. Asking for help and giving help when you can is the same thing as love. Craig has now returned to church and sings for them with his beautiful voice. During the race, Craig and I loved each other and let each other shine where we could, or helped when they couldn't. We set our intentions every day and had no expectations for the race, just to be together and experience it in my time left. When we got to the last leg, we thought maybe this just might happen. That last episode was a doozy. We flew from Toronto to Vancouver, getting a cab and finding the first clue. I jumped out of a helicopter into the ocean. We roller skated. We had to sing La Traviata in Italian and find 10 meals at the Richmond night market that was crazy crowded, then figuring out a bunch of riddles at the Richmond night market that was crazy crowded, and figuring out a bunch of riddles after more than 24 hours of being awake. Walking onto that field at the end felt absolutely surreal. It felt magical. It felt impossible, but we had done it and changed what everyone thought was impossible, including us, into reality. It will be something that I will remember for the rest of my life. I want to see my kids graduate from school. I want to meet the people that my children will fall in love with. I want to see my grandchildren, if they have any, or just watch them grow into like beautiful adults. I want that challenge. I want to advocate for myself and others. I want to push barriers and challenge the impossible. Every day feels like a bonus. However, every day still feels like a challenge. How do I make the most impact? How do I lead the way for others in my circumstance? How do I stand up to all the MRIs with no fear and in a positive mood? How do I have hope for my future? I have to. I have to believe that something I do might not help me, but will help others down the road. Being part of a trial, talking openly about what I struggle with daily. Memory, did I use my words correctly? Dealing with the fact that I used to have a photographic memory, how chemo has killed my thyroid and so now I'm on Synthroid, how my Raynaud's is so bad I can sometimes not feel my hands or feet all day, even when it's warm out. But there's a reason why it doesn't bother me. I can still walk, I can still talk, although that took a little while to get back through speech therapy. I can still sing, I can still dance, I can still love, I can still advocate, that is my legacy. This platform is my legacy, to be able to stand behind people and help them ask the right questions, or be there to understand what they're going through and to raise money to help find a cure. Craig and I have many plans for the future, and our team on The Amazing Race was named Team Broadway. We have now taken on another name of Cancer Dancer, and we will be doing speeches, as Emma has said, around Canada on racing with faith. Thank you so much for having me here tonight. Hope you all can hear me out at the lake. I'll open it up for questions now, if you have any.
We could definitely hear you. And thank you so much, Catherine. Thank you so much for being willing to share your story with us, originally with Rhiannon, and again with us this evening. It's so wonderful to hear from you, and to feel your positivity and your energy just coming through the screen. I'm wondering if you could, I'm sure folks have some questions for you, but while these questions percolate for people, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about your own personal faith, and your experience with that faith as you've journeyed through cancer.
So I always grew up with my mom just always telling me, God is love, God is love, God is love. And that was all I needed until I sort of moved away from home. I was baptized at St. Andrew's United Church and confirmed there as well. And I just thought, God is love, God is love. And then, I started questioning, like, well, God is love. How does this happen? And why is this happening? And so I sort of, I didn't really go to church when I moved to Toronto. I sang in the junior choir. Now back home, I sing with the adult choir. But I sort of went through a stage where I questioned who God was and what that meant to me. And once I was diagnosed, I like I said, I was really angry, and I didn't want to believe that God would make me face this, but I also believe that God gave it to me for a reason, or someone up there gave it to me for a reason. I'm not sure I believe in a God. I just believe that, God is love. So for me, somebody that loved me put this challenge in front of me to make me realize that, one, I can be an advocate for people that have this diagnosis, and two, to show my family and my chosen family what I can do with this illness and with this terminal illness, and show them that it won't stop me, and to prove to my kids that this will not stop me. And I think that that's why I was picked, or not picked, but why I was given this disease. And so I feel like that it wasn't by choice, it was just by what happened, if that makes any sense.
It absolutely does. It absolutely does. There's some folks in the chat just thanking you for sharing this. Janice says it was inspirational watching you and Craig participate in the race. You're strong and courageous, and we cheered you on your journey across Canada. Faith can and does hold us up during trying times. Absolutely.
Yes, hard times.
So Craig isn't here with us this evening. I know he would have loved to have been
Not
here.
a cruise in Alaska.
It would have been wonderful to speak with both of you. I'm wondering, you've been friends for so long and through so many different experiences in both of your own lives, and friendships can be tested by a great many number of things that are less weighty than what you have both gone through. So what do you think it has been that's kept your friendship together?
I just think we trust each other. I don't think there's anything else but the trust that we have in each other. I know he would, when we're together, we lift each other up. And I just think that I have the utmost trust for him. And I think that's how we have maintained everything. I trust him to do, even if I don't think it's right, I trust him that he'll do what he thinks is right for me. And he knows that I'll do what I think is right for him. And we would never question the person's why we did it. It would just be like, I know you did that, and I'm not sure why you did that, but I know you did it for me. And the same would be for him, So I think it's just that trust we have in each other.
And you should be able to expect that from a friend. So that's wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah.
It sounds like from what you shared with Rhiannon that the Amazing Race was wonderful, but also really tough. What was the biggest challenge, would you say?
Ah, the lack of sleep, the lack of communication with every like I couldn't call my kids. I couldn't call anybody. I couldn't call you get to the airport, they take your phone. There's no phone in your room. Then you travel and you don't know what's happening. You're not, and finding time to eat and finding time to, nourish your body and finding time to, sit down and meditate in the morning and, finding time to do anything really. But it was a sort of a test of our friendship and of our love for each other. And I think that was never an issue for us. So I think that we just sailed through that part. And that was probably the hardest part of it. And because it was so easy for us, that helped us to get the win, I guess.
Lack of sleep would be very tough. I think that would be the clincher for me.
See, for Craig, it was. For me, I really don't sleep all that much. So it wasn't that big of a deal for me.
Wondering what's coming up next for you, what you're working on.
Well, I was just telling you, Emma, that I'm doing Rainbow Stage in Winnipeg this year. I start next Monday, so I'm learning my lines for Little Mermaid. But coming in September, we'll be doing a lot of speaking to churches and to schools and to different communities.
That's wonderful.
And performing still. I love performing. Oh, and actually, in February, Craig and I are doing Romeo and Juliet. He's playing Lord Capulet and I'm playing Lady Capulet with the Royal Winnipeg Ballet. I forgot about that. That's what we're doing. And we're actually going to be making a little documentary about it too.
Oh,
and
that's so
it's
neat.
going to be called Cancer Dancer. So watch for that.
So if you're in Winnipeg, folks who are listening, and you want to see some wonderful stage performances, go see Catherine and Craig. The comment from Leaf says, I love that we're having conversations about things that once came with so much stigma. It's hard for people to learn enough to live and survive when they experience them, namely the big C and LGBTQ plus issues. You'll be in my prayers, Catherine. That's lovely.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Catherine, for being here. I know you're enjoying some time away, so thanks so much for joining us and for sharing more of your story.
You're welcome.
So wonderful to hear
it. Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for having me.
That was wonderful. So we're going to move to our final guest, who is also a fantastic advocate for issues that need to be uplifted, and that is Emilio Rodriguez. Emilio is the Refugee and Migrant Rights Policy Analyst at Citizens for Public Justice, a Canadian social justice organization that focuses on poverty, climate justice, and rights for refugees. Emilio spoke with Mzwandile Poncana for his story Not Welcome about how Canada detains migrants in provincial jails and immigration holding centers. Please welcome Emilio.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here with you all and to be among these amazing speakers. I hope that I can also speak about an issue that I'm sure that many of us care about, and it's around justice for migrants and refugees in Canada. So in this current edition of Broadview magazine, I was invited to contribute to articles about two issues that I think are central to understanding advocacy for human rights-based immigration policies in Canada. First is a campaign to end immigration detentions, and second are the calls to repeal the Safe Third Country Agreement with the US. I think these are two issues that really challenge this traditionally positive light in which many of us see Canadian immigration. There's this narrative that Canada portrays internationally, that we're a country that welcomes refugees and migrants with open arms. And while this is true in many respects, including in the noble efforts that thousands of volunteers across the country do to resettle refugees through the private sponsorship of refugees program, I think this is not the whole story. There are many campaigns led by migrants themselves and activists that walk alongside them that highlight several injustices that are embedded in Canada's immigration policies and processes. I've been trying to learn about this complex system since I immigrated to Canada 8 years ago and began my involvement in refugee and migrant rights efforts. I understood some of those impacts through my own experience, borders really became real for me at a very young age, and not a concept I could theorize on, but a tangible barrier that I had to contend with. I also sought training in public policy that helped me tie some of these knots, but the catalyst has truly been my involvement as a lead in the policy in the refugee and migrant rights file at Citizens for Public Justice, a national advocacy organization. At CPJ, at Citizens for Public Justice, we focus on human rights-based approaches to Canadian immigration, to poverty eradication, and climate justice in Canada, rooted in a tradition that's faith-based and that has broad ecumenical support across the country. I've had the honor of collaborating with incredible activists and see the direct impact of civil society through this work. And one of these areas has been around immigration attention, which is the issue that Broadview magazine featured in this July-August issue. So I want to talk to you a little bit about immigration attention, about the campaigns that we lead at CPJ, and about some of the impact that we've had, which I believe has been really large in terms of how much we have advanced, but that we also have a lot of ground to cover as well. So to give you a bit of background, between April 2019 and March 2020, just to give you a timeline, almost 9,000 people were in detention on grounds related to their immigration status. This included 138 infants and children. Many of the people in detention are refugee claimants waiting on the results of their refugee hearings. A lot of people, when we started this campaign, were telling us that this wasn't an issue that we're very aware about. And that's why I believe it's really important that we advance advocacy efforts around it. There was a report by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International that was published in 2021, which exposed some of the human rights abuses that take place in detention and documented the long-lasting effects that it has on the mental health of detainees. When we really sit down and scrutinize the reasons that are behind some of these immigration detentions, the tremendously negative impact that it has on detainees, and the availability of alternatives, it really becomes a practice that is impossible to justify. So at CPJ, we decided to support the Welcome to Canada campaign. I started in the role at CPJ in January 2022, and this was really the first file that I decided to take on in partnership with Human Rights Watch. And we had a particular focus on mobilizing religious leaders and members of faith communities. We began by coordinating an interfaith statement that was signed by more than 180 religious leaders, organizations, and community members. We organized interfaith public awareness events. We coordinated letters from religious leaders that were sent to provincial and federal ministers, and we arranged meetings with these provincial and federal ministers as well. We knew that this was an issue that could gather broad interfaith support, as thousands of us, including, as I'm sure many people in this room, are aligned in the pursuit of justice and the respect for fundamental human rights. Thanks to this great advocacy, which again has been led mainly by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, and that has been supported by many partner organizations like CPJ, I'm happy to share that 8 provinces have now committed to canceling their agreements with the Canadian Border Services Agency that allow for immigration detention to take place in provincial correctional facilities. This is something to celebrate because in these provincial correctional facilities, the measures that were taken were the most punitive. But our advocacy must not end here. We're now focused on making sure that provinces follow through with these commitments, that they institute alternatives to detention, and not simply hold migrants in immigration holding centers to replace provincial correctional facilities. We're also placing the attention now at the federal level. We're urging ministers to eradicate this practice, and we're calling for an implementation of oversight mechanisms to the Canadian Border Services Agency, the agency that has been predominantly in charge of detentions in Canada, to reduce the instances of human rights violations that have been observed through some of the research and the advocacy that many organizations have led in the sector. I really believe that we as civil society must continue to take firm stances rooted in a broad respect for human rights and the inherent dignity of all people. And I was really pleased to be interviewed by both Swandile and Julie for the pieces featured in this issue. I am grateful to speak with you all, and I'm happy to take any questions. I would love to share more about CPJ as well as some of the other campaigns that we're leading. One of the pieces that was featured as well was an interview with Julie where I was speaking more about the Safe Third Country Agreement between Canada and the US and some of the impacts that has for asylum seekers. So I would really welcome your thoughts and questions around this, and thank you again for having me.
Thank you so much, Emilio. Thank you so much for being here. One of the most shocking things that you spoke about that was centered in on the interview with Julie was about children in immigration detention. And I don't think I knew that. I think there's been a lot of attention on the US detaining migrant children. I'm sure many of our readers weren't aware that Canada detains children as well. Do you have is there any work that CPJ is coordinating or working with partner organizations on to pressure the federal government to cease that practice? Or do you have any insight into the kind of conditions that children are being detained in?
Yeah, absolutely. I think something to emphasize here around the detention of children and in general around immigration detention is that we do see that the rates in the US are higher, but that doesn't exonerate Canada from paying attention to our own issues. And it's something that, Julie, I was speaking about with Julie, that we should really look at our issues and try to improve those as opposed to comparing or feeling like because the US has higher rates, then we should feel more okay about it. In terms of children and immigration, CPJ is actually authoring a book that's looking at advocacy across Canada in key issues like this. And we have a person that's going to be talking specifically about the detention of children and some of the alternatives to detention. I think alternatives to detention are critical across the board. But when we're talking about children, the situation is even more critical and vulnerable. It's an issue that requires the attention of a broad number of partners and organizations. I think from the outset, something that I would mention is that there are certainly organizations and community members that are more equipped to address this issue than the authorities in the provincial correctional facilities or in CDSA that are handling it right now. So as a start, I think we should be looking at those alternatives to detention. But I'll be happy to share more about the book once it's published and about that particular chapter, which I think it's quite critical and it's an issue that we should all be thinking about as well.
Sherry Lynn, who's in the chat, is wondering which provinces have agreed to end immigration detention and which have not.
Yes, so I have the list of 8 provinces right now. BC was the first, then Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and recently Ontario and Quebec. That was very, very relevant to this campaign because, as we all can imagine, Ontario and Quebec are really the largest provinces and where most of the immigration detainees are held. Ontario was the last one to promise that they will cancel these agreements. And the way that it works is that the provinces commit to it, and then there's a year in which those agreements are still valid. So we're really calling for all advocates to put pressure on provincial governments that have released these public statements and to say, after the year ends, what's the plan? CDSA, what's the plan? Where are we going from here? Because we shouldn't bounce back to detention.
Eric's wondering whether or not you have stats on how many people are in detention at any given time and how many of those are children.
Yeah, thank you. The stats that I provided, I think, gives a breakdown for those two. So again, between April 2019 and March 2020, so roughly within that year, there were 9,000 people in detention, and that included 138 children. Now, numbers really vary according to the year. We actually saw in the later part of 2020 a reduction in the number of people in detention due to the COVID-19 pandemic, which really shows that there are alternatives to this, that it's not something that Canada must do. In fact, if you look at the reasons why people are detained, the vast majority, I believe it's something like 88%, are detained because of a concept called flight risk, which essentially means that CBSA fears that people are not going to show up to their refugee hearings, and that justifies, to their view, their detention. So that's about a little bit about some of those numbers.
What are some of these alternatives to detention that you could envision?
Yeah, so I think at CPJ, we're really embarking on this path to around an idea or to act in solidarity with organizations and movements that are trying to eradicate detentions more broadly, right? To seek community-based alternatives. And in this case, what we're seeing is, again, the vast majority of people that are being detained because of flight risk, and many of them are due to report to refugee hearings. So we really believe that the best solutions are to connect them to legal support, to tell them about what their options are, to share more about their rights, and to help them prepare for the refugee hearings. We don't have evidence that suggests that that these people don't want to be part of this processes. So I think one of the alternatives is to turn it back around and say, how can we support them in these difficult times? We have to think again about what the Canadian welcome is. And again, we're a country that yearns to be defined by a positive attitude towards newcomers, by an awareness of some of the fears and the persecution that they're fleeing. So I think we have to turn it around and say, how can we support these people, as opposed to problematizing them and criminalizing them for seeking refuge.
To turn to the Safe Third Country Agreement, the interview that you mentioned focuses on changes to that agreement, where now there are more opportunities for border agents to potentially to turn migrants back to the US. What would you say to people who don't empathize with folks who who irregularly cross borders as opposed to going through other channels?
This is a great question. Thank you very much. So I would give you some numbers, which I think for me have really changed my entire perspective around this. There are approximately 100 million displaced people in the world. And roughly, as an estimate, around 90,000, 100,000 of them get permanently resettled every year in countries like Canada, the US, and other countries in Europe. We're comparing 100,000 people that get permanently resettled to approximately 100 million that are forcibly displaced. So when people talk about a line or a queue and they call asylum seekers queue jumpers, I like to tell them that it's not a queue. It's really a lottery. It's a roulette. There are millions of people that simply don't have access to these mechanisms that facilitate refugee sponsorship. Many of them do, and many do come to Canada, and it's crucial that we maintain that support. It's crucial that we expand those pathways and that we guarantee that those people get the safety that they need. But it's also important that we empathize with some of the plights of the people that are not able to fit within the 1% that gets permanently resettled every year. I think those numbers really put it to perspective for me. And the other is that we're seeing displacement from the Central American region, and in particular across the US-Mexico border, and many of those are also coming up to Canada and filing refugee claims. And that's a particular displacement crisis that I'm familiar with as a Salvadorian. And the reality is that refugee policies and the way that we think about displacement is not protecting this particular population. The US and Canada have repeatedly fought to not categorize people fleeing from the region as refugees. They try to categorize them as economic migrants, even though thousands of them are fleeing persecution. So it's important to understand how some of these systems work and how they really exclude millions of people. And I think the empathy must flow from there.
Thank you. That's really, really helpful. I know there are a couple of comments. There's a question or two. There is some time after the event, so any of you guests that have some extra time to stick around, please do. We'll have a more informal discussion session afterwards. Thank you so much, Emilio, for being here and enlightening us about the work that you're doing, that CPJ is doing. And I think there are some links in the chat about CPJ's work on this issue. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
And thank you to all of you for being here. There was so much shared, and I'm sure I have more questions. There's more to reflect on. So there will be some informal chat time afterwards for those who have some time to stick around. But that brings us to the end of our formal program. So thank you so much, especially to Josiah, Catherine, and Emilio, who volunteered their time to make this event possible. After this event is over, please stay on if you'd like. Tomorrow we'll also be sending you a short survey by email so you can share your thoughts with us about this event. Broadview's online reading clubs are free, but it costs us $2,700 a year for a Zoom plan that can handle a group event of this size. If you're already a donor to Broadview, thank you so much. Your donations help Broadview continue to feature exceptional people like Catherine, Emilio, and Josiah. If you're not a donor, please consider making a small donation for tonight's event. Charlotte will post a link for donations in the chat, and we will also include a donations link with tomorrow's survey. Otherwise, thank you so much for being here. Be well, and hope to see you back here again on September 11th when we're going to be talking about the September issue. Good night, everybody. So there are many of us still here. That's wonderful. I know there were a couple of questions. Leaf, you had a question? You had a question, I think, for Emilio, maybe? Leaf, you might have headed out. Are there other questions that folks had for the guests or other reflections on other stories from the issue that we didn't talk about? I know Leaf had a question regarding the international declaration. If there is an international declaration on the rights of refugees, or are they under the umbrella of declarations like the UN Declaration of Human Rights? Emilio, do you know if there's a formal document on refugee rights?
Yes, there is. So the main document is the 1951 Convention and the 1967 protocol that expanded that convention to different refugee populations. So the 1951 Convention was implemented right after World War II and was meant to protect people under certain grounds of persecution that are still used right now and that are very much incorporated into the domestic refugee law of different countries, including Canada. The 1967 protocol basically expanded the convention to then qualify for refugees that were not necessarily just coming from Europe, but that were also coming from different regions. So yeah, that's a mechanism that addresses it.
Thank you. Josiah, I had a question for you. You are here. I was wondering if because part of what you explore in the book is your own journey to away from the framework of your childhood towards sort of finding your own path, and then more recently trying to find a new framework to understand the world. I'm wondering if you feel that is unique to you, if that's something that you think other folks who grew up with very all-encompassing belief systems also experience. Is that something that you have spoken to others about? Do you have a sense that that's a shared experience, if that makes any sense at all?
Yeah, that I think that experience of for those of us who grew up with very kind of narrowly defined uh, worldviews or versions of religion that said, this is the one way, everyone else who's not on it is lost. I think a lot of people who grew up that way have an experience of sort of deconstructing that worldview and and then you know taking it apart and and then piecing something back together that matches with your actual experience of the world. And I forget which there's a writer who I remember reading who talked about sort of these phases that you go through of believing in something, and then losing that belief, and then to believe in it again in a way that isn't the same, but it I'm trying to remember who it was. Anyway, a lot of people who I've talked to have had similar experiences. It's very common for people who grew up in evangelical contexts or Mennonite or many other many people that I talk to have had similar experiences of having to deconstruct their belief system and then come to a new understanding of some of the pieces of that do have meaning, but maybe they have meaning on a metaphorical level instead of a literal level. Maybe they have meaning on a mystical level instead of a literal level. So yeah, it's a very common experience among people that I know and talk to.
And hopefully maybe that's been helpful in some ways, or has that been at all helpful to learn that others have had similar experiences?
Oh, certainly, absolutely. It's helpful to talk to other people about their spiritual process and their religious journey. And people arrive in different places, and I'm always fascinated by people's stories and their journeys, and how they how we make meaning out of life, because really all of us are telling ourselves stories about why we're here and what the purpose of existence is, and that storytelling is what happens in religion and spirituality, but it's also beyond that. I mean, it's in politics, it's in everything, is this kind of story making, this creating narratives that give meaning to our lives. And I think it's an essential part of what it is to be human. So I'm fascinated by people's journeys and their experiences. Yeah.
Thank you. Michael, you have a question for Josiah. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi Josiah. You were talking earlier a little bit about sort of times when it is maybe more or sort of less appropriate to be adopting a tact of sort of a bit hardline and focusing on maybe some of the challenges and the problems and the real threats and dangers, and then sort of times for positivity and optimism. And I'm wondering if you've had any opportunities to look at this within sort of with people doing kind of conservation research and sort of the applied and research side of things as well. That's a field that I work in actually, and I know one of the critiques of invasion science and invasion biology in particular is that far too often as scientists we've kind of leaned on sort of the language of like a crisis discipline, where you get urgency for the work and you get urgency for funding and for people to care by sort of focusing on how much of sort of the crisis this is, and it can be a very negative kind of sort of rhetoric to use for that. And there's been some discussion about adopting more of a focus on sort of positive facing actions and ecological restoration and that sort of thing. So I'm curious if you sort of run into any of that, or sort of have thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's very interesting to hear. I haven't heard that sort of articulated clearly the way you did just now about what it's like within the science discipline, and leaning on crisis language to get funding. I haven't spoken as much with people who are doing sort of that kind of conservation work. Well, I've worked with them, but I tend to be involved in campaigns around, activism is similar. You're focusing on what's not working, on the negative. Journalism is often like that too. Journalism, as when I was taking journalism school, if it bleeds, it leads. That was kind of the slogan. So that makes a lot of sense to me, that maybe it's not that the bad news isn't real, but I think you're right that we don't spend enough time looking at what is working and has worked, and all the incredibly significant ways that humans are working to protect natural spaces. And care for the earth, and protect ecosystems. I do think that there's not enough of that kind of storytelling and that kind of narrative approach, and there's a danger in focusing too much on everything that's not working or falling apart or going wrong, and neglecting the work that's really happening, that's powerful and significant and important. I know probably people have read the work of Potawatomi scholar and biologist Robin Wall Kimmerer, the book Braiding Sweetgrass, where she has this conversation with her students at the beginning, and she says, she asked them, is there anything that humans contribute to the natural world? Is there any way in which humans benefit the natural world? And they say no. And she's just heartbroken by this response, because she says, that's not how I see the natural world. That's not how my spiritual tradition sees the natural world. We're interdependent, and we're caring for each other. And there are many ways in which the natural world and the earth needs us, right? And so if we forget that, that's dangerous too.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think there's definitely a balancing act there, and it was just interesting because it felt very resonant to, I think, my experiences with it. So yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your experience too in the scientific field. That would be interesting. I'd like to hear more about that.
Another question for you, Emilio, and this also relates to maybe a personal experience a little bit. Wondering how what fueled your passion for this kind of work with CPJ, working with migrants, working with refugees. What really animates you in this work? If it's a personal experience or an interest, or
Yeah, I think I would say two reasons. One has been, as you mentioned, personal experience. I think growing up in El Salvador, I had an acute awareness of displacement and some of the sources and the reasons and the dangers in the migrant routes and the lack of accessibility for protection. When I came to Canada as an international student, there were some aspects of it, of the migration journey, that I could relate to. Others that obviously I couldn't, because there's a privilege to coming as an international student versus other migrant categories. So I think to me, really, when we talk about the different struggles that we're facing in the world around decolonizing, around racism, around this very, very systemic issues, migration is very much one of those areas where those are seen very strongly. Borders are in many ways violence. So I think it was just an area that I've always felt connected to, and that the more that I work around the issue, the more I realize that there's really critical work to be done. The second, I think the reason why I work with CPJ is I come from a faith tradition that emphasizes the imperative to focus on justice. Many may be familiar here with Archbishop Oscar Romero, who was a priest in the 1980s, 70s, 80s in El Salvador. No, sorry, 70s. He was murdered in, I believe, 1980. But those ideas that we should very much center the experience of those that are marginalized, that are oppressed by the systems, and that our faith demands a response to that, is something that I've always connected with, and something that I feel CPJ also champions. So I don't necessarily feel comfortable in many faith communities, and to me, CPJ becomes one of those homes because the work that we do, it's, in my view, to a degree also spiritual. At least it's a response to the spiritual relations that we have with our Creator. So that's a bit of the background on the focus.
Thank you. So a question for you from Andrea. She's wondering whether what's something you wish more Canadians knew about our immigration system?
Thank you. I think there are many. I mean, the two issues that I shared, I think, are some of the most critical. I've spoken enough about, I think, immigration tensions in this case, but around the SCCA, the Safe Third Country Agreement, it's really an effort from the Canadian government to evade its responsibility to provide asylum to people that are desperately seeking for protection. And I wish that more people could realize that Canada is not necessarily right or wrong or good or bad. There are many positive programs that get really highlighted in the space, but there are also very, very negative experiences, a lot of discrimination, a lot of injustice. So I would really want people to be more familiarized with some of these policies that are very much evident and that manifest some of the racism that's still embedded in Canadian immigration. And I guess the second thing is, I would love for all of us to do a bit more learning about history in general, but in particular history about Canadian immigration. The immigration systems that we have today and the ways in which they highlight racism and discrimination are not accidental. Really, Canada was built as a nation that was predominantly favoring immigrants from Europe at the expense of immigrants from other regions in the world. One that was also creating migration pathways for people that were racialized, that exploited their labor for the benefit of Canadian industries. And we see the examples of that at the agricultural sector, in caregiving. If we look at the Canadian Railroad and discrimination against Chinese people, for example, in the early construction of it, there are so many examples of why we still see that same discrimination today, and it's not accidental. So I guess I gave two things, but I think a greater awareness of these dynamics could help people be a bit more empathetic and could help people support some of these policies that I think are desperately needed to make it more just.
Knowing our history is important to informing the kinds of decisions we make going forward. So thank you so much, Emilio. Thank you, Josiah. Thank you to both of you for being willing to share more. And thank you to those of you who stuck around. I think we'll wrap it up for this evening. Thanks for your wonderful questions and reflections, and have a good evening. Good night.